Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Resource Adequacy Modeling and Program Design Working Group. Today we'll be discussing the LSE survey that was recently published to the RAMP initiative webpage for RA modeling. Before we get started, I just want to ensure you are aware that the materials that we'll be discussing today are available out on the initiative webpage, and you can get to that page by going to kaiso.com. On the main page, you'll see the State Informed tab. Underneath that tab, you'll want to click out to Policy Initiatives, and that will take you to our main initiative landing page. And then towards the very bottom of that page, you'll see a link out to the RAMP initiative. And then the presentation that we're going over today, along with the LSE survey, are both posted to that webpage. So as a reminder, today's call is being recorded. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. These working groups are intended to be collaborative and stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives, and so we welcome your comments and feedback, but just a reminder to keep those comments professional and respectful. We will be pausing for questions throughout the call today, so if you've connected to audio through the WebEx, then you can raise your hand using the raise hand icon, which is located at the bottom of your screen or next to your name. If you dialed in separately to the meeting, you'll need to press #2 to raise your hand. And then if everyone could please just remember to state your name and affiliation prior to making your comment or asking your question, that would be great, just so we know who the question or comment is coming from. And then you can also send your question or comment through the chat to me directly. My name is Isabella Nicosia. I represent Stakeholder Affairs here at the ISO, or you can send your question to all panelists, and we'll be monitoring that today. So this slide here just shows where we're currently at in the policy initiative process, and we are still here at the beginning stages of proposal development at the discussion paper and working groups. The agenda for today, in a few minutes here, I'll hand things over to Aditya to go over a recap of the modeling scope. And then Samuel is going to cover the LSE survey discussion and dive into that topic. And then we'll leave some time at the end for questions and next steps, and then we'll close out the meeting. So with that, I will turn things over to Aditya, and we'll kick things off.
Thank you, Isabella, and I'd like to thank the attendees for today's discussion on the LSE survey, which was one of the topics that was extensively discussed in the working groups over the last few months. As we may have a few new attendees to the call today, we figured it might be helpful for all of us to do a quick 5-minute recap on the modeling scope. We should have plenty of time for a good amount of Q&As today. So please feel free to raise your hand or ask questions along the way. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the RA modeling is to understand resource adequacy sufficiency across 3 time horizons. The time horizons are categorized on in the first column there: year ahead, years 2 to 4, and years 5 to 10. The purpose of each of them is what I will discuss briefly next. The year ahead RA modeling exercise is to assess if the RA showings are adequate. It's a sufficiency analysis of RA showings. The purpose is to understand, are the resources collectively shown to the ISO BAA sufficient to meet 1 day in 10 kind of a planning standard. And if it is sufficient, an excess will calculate what the excess amount is. If it is a shortfall, we'll determine what the shortfall is. One of the other topics that was discussed in the working groups is to update the default PRM and default counting rules, and this analysis will help inform that exercise. And then this is basically using and applying the current principles of RA showings. Whatever is used in the current framework is what this is assessing from a probabilistic standpoint. Years 2, 3, and 4 is to assess if the current levelized authorized procurement and contracted capacity by all the LSEs is sufficient, or will the future projected resources be sufficient in the future? Do we have enough collectively is the purpose of this assessment time frame. Years 5 through 10 is to assess our long-term plans producing resource adequate portfolios to meet reliability targets. That's where we get more creative in understanding LOLE versus additional metrics and stuff like that. What counting rules to apply, how do we develop, all of those will be future stakeholder engagement conversations, but basically trying to understand resource adequacy across the various time horizons is the purpose of this modeling work stream part of the RA working group. Next slide, please. So in order to assess and make reasonable resource portfolio assumptions for these different time frames, a few approaches were thought through. And then based on stakeholder feedback and looking at the frequency of how this information is publicly available or posted, what level of granularity is available, the availability of information for all LSEs and a few other factors, it was a stakeholder survey made the most sense to collect information. So for short term, Sam will discuss more about these specifics, but I'm going to give you a high level. Short term, we are asking for 100% year ahead, non-binding soft showing information. For midterm, we're asking for all RA eligible resources and authorized procurement and contracted capacity kind of amounts. Basically, LSE's representation of what your resource fleet will be in the midterm time space. And long term, it's the same concept, all resources and resource plan information. And then in each of these time frames, the idea is LSEs will provide sufficient resources in the survey to meet their current LRA-RA obligations. Next slide, please. So really quickly, why is this data being requested? As we all know from SB 100 and then other drivers and GHG regulation reductions and other drivers, we are seeing an accelerated fleet transition towards renewables and battery resources and other new technology resources. So as that transition happens, it's important for us to really understand the resources, their attributes, their availability, their other parameters of assessment at the BA level to see if we will have enough resources and attributes going into the future. As mentioned earlier, this will be used to update the default TRM and default counting rules. Today's focus is primarily on the survey discussion, but as once the survey is returned back to us, we will have additional stakeholder engagements to talk about what is the methodology and how will we inform and how will we calculate all of these the TRM and counting rules. That will be in the coming months to have more touch points there. So the LSEs are requested to provide your latest views of resource evolution in the coming years as you foresee how your footprint is going to change. It's a bottom-up compilation of all the LSE views. Next slide, please. The next couple of slides basically show what was discussed in the previous working group discussions. I'm going to skip over them because Sam will be talking about them in more detail, but the idea is you have your peak megawatts, your reserve requirement, whatever that would translate to in the capacity from reserve capacity in the third row and in QC capacity, and then identify all the different resources that would meet the requirement each of these months for the year ahead time frame. Next slide, please. For the short midterm is what is shown here. Basically, you list out all your resources, your ISO, queue number if available, resource name, installed capacity, COD, fuel type. We removed the deliverability location and area in the actual survey, so an updated survey was posted on the website. Next slide, please. Yeah, before we get into the details and I pass it to Sam, a couple of other things that I wanted to mention. This is a voluntary survey that is being sent out by the ISO, but we request 100% participation for us to be able to represent the system and the BAA and fleet transition more reasonably. A high-level timeline is it's due on May 16th, so we have a couple of 3-4 weeks for us to go through, and if you have any questions, we'll be happy to provide any answers to those. And before I pass it to Sam, I'll probably pause here for any questions. I see Lawrence.
I could be unmute Lauren Carr. Thanks.
CCA, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Can you go back to the last slide, please, slide 11? I just was hoping that you could provide some information about what specifically you're looking for from LSEs in terms of the summary information and then retirement assumptions. So, you know, given the time frame, LSEs won't have all the information from the CEC about their load forecast and the CPUC about the PRM, like what the PRM will be in each year. So I'm just wondering how you want LSEs to reflect those values. And then also what you're looking for from LSEs on retirement assumptions and why LSEs are providing that. I'm not quite sure how they would come up with those themselves. So any information you could provide around the specifics of what you're looking for LSEs to provide related to those things would be helpful.
Sure, thanks, Lauren. So as it relates to PRM values, I think you can assume the current level of planning reserve margin applicable to the future years. Obviously, things are changing. LRA PRMs are evolving, but as we know, we don't have information on all of those things. We can apply the same planning reserve margin as it is today. As far as retirements go, so fleet transition is both pieces, right? Additions and retirement. So whatever retirement assumptions that you would like us to model should be indicated. So there is a notes column in the resources that might be one way to indicate resource retirement date for us, or if there is a resource that shows up in the midterm but does not show up in the long term, that's another way for us to see if it doesn't make it into the long-term time frame. We can assume a retirement date of 12/31/27. So yeah, that's some ways of presenting. And we are all okay to make a reasonable set of assumptions, but that's happening at the LSE by LSE level here. Hope that answers your question, Lauren.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Robert?
Robert Gomez from PG&E. On the retirement discussion, so we have a lot of contracts, and those contracts, some contracts may end, and that would be a reason why something doesn't continue into the future. We may not know if that contract is going to retire or not, but we know it's out of our portfolio. So just by having, I guess, a contract end may not mean it's a retirement of a particular.
That is correct. So that's why I'm not tying this back to a contract, or you're not asking to give us that information. We're asking information on how should we represent 26, for example, 27, for example. So that's the idea. Robert, as you complete the survey, if you feel that it should continue through time, regardless of the contract expiration date, it should be shown.
Okay, let me clarify. So you're saying if we have no information on a retirement of a particular unit, even though our contract expires, it should still continue in the spreadsheet. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, if you feel like it should be continuing, it should be a resource that should be counted, then yeah, leave it as it is. And if it is a contract that expires 10 years from today, we don't need to know that information. But if it expires 5 years from today, but you want us to assume that it will automatically be extended beyond that time frame, yeah, you are free to make those assumptions to the best of your knowledge. Whatever you would like to make an assumption at the time of survey submission is okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Noah?
This is Noah Tong from Middle River Power. Just following up on that discussion, I mean, if the intent here is to understand what resources are contracted, but not what resources are on the grid to inform of the reliability aspect, then shouldn't LSEs not be predicting what they or may not, what they may or may not be contracting with in the future if they don't have a current contract?
So as we go into the future, there will be gaps. Right now, that is the purpose of the IRP process, for example. So in spaces where you will have to make assumptions, I think you should make those assumptions. That at the time of the survey, whatever makes sense, right?
I'm not sure you should be making those assumptions, because if you're simply looking at maybe put it another way, if folks make assumptions on what resources will not retire, then the ISO could do that without asking for this data in the first place. Right, you need to be based on the principle base of what's under contract to inform of your study. It's a snapshot in time. You're not. I agree that you're not going to get anything perfect, but if you're simply looking at what's under contract, then those things that are not under contract, if a contract ends in 2026, should not make an assumption that that resource is going to be extended under contract for 2027 and beyond.
So the idea is to have sufficient resources for the 10-year time frame, right? So if a known resource is contract expires, but there are two ways to fill the gap for the following year. Either you assume an extension, that's a reasonable assumption, or you assume it will be replaced with a new type, right? So both of them are an assumption. So that's why I'm saying that the LSE is free to make that assumption and determination to see what their fleet of resources will be in 27, 28, 29, for example, right?
Yeah, I think maybe the question then is just simply, for existing resources, are you limiting Or do you want to limit LSCs from showing what's under contract versus new resources that they currently have under contract but are not COD?
Yeah, I guess that will change from LSC to LSC.
Right. Well, no.
And resource type.
Well, no. You should set some ground rules. What, right? To help better inform the ISO what's under contract.
No, I'll touch base with you. And then, the other thing I forgot to mention is we plan to also post an FAQ document to the website a couple of days after this call to answer some of these questions that were asked during the workshop. So as part of that, I will address the contract question.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thank you, Noah. Nadine?
Unmute Mary.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, this is Mary Deal representing ARB. So I just wanted to join in on this discussion of like what's under contract here, and because I'm a little confused by this template, because in the instructions I think it talks about resource additions and retirements, and you have here, you know, COD like for new additions, but you don't have a comparable field for a retirement or an contract expiration. But if we're only looking at additions and retirements, that wouldn't include, you know, stuff, existing resources under contract. So then why, if that's excluded, why would you show, you know, your total contract capacity equaling your total load? So do you really just want everything for the midterm or just new additions? Like, do you want existing and new or just new and retirements, like incremental?
So correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe the way I think about this is contract is a term for ensuring that the particular resource can be claimed as an RA resource by that LSE in their supply plans, right? So the focus is on what are the resources that make up your fleet in 2026 is the question. If they are a part of a contract or if it's part of a new resource that will be added to the system, that is fine. So it's not an assessment of the contracts, because obviously contracts get extended, contracts right? Once it is terminated, it goes back into the market. All of those contractual behavior is not being assessed here. It's basically what should be my resource fleet in 27 look like, 28 look like. That's where it happens, right? When you're saying if you want to retire a particular resource, indicate the date of retirement in the notes section. The idea was to simplify this template as much as possible, so we didn't want to add too many columns to it.
Okay, so if an LLC does have a contract with an existing resource that's already online, but it's a long-term contract for a year that it would include your 2026, but I mean, usually the KAISO already knows it's online, it's been operating for a while, should it be reported in this template?
Yes. All existing and new and retirements that become part of your 26 is. Oh, I see where the confusion is. Sorry, I think it's in the summary, it's not the total contracted capacity, it's total capacity for peak month. Right, it's total available capacity. So contracts, new, that will probably come under contract, and existing resources. And then we'll also show retirements in the notes column.
Right, but the retirements won't be included in that summation formula if it's in the notes column.
Yes, but it will not be shown in the next year's 2027, right? Let's say a particular resource retires. Oh yeah, it will not be in the column.
I thought that the summation was just based on the COD date, but
Yes, yeah. We can update that and repost a spreadsheet. That's a good point. Maybe we'll just add a retirement date if that makes it easier.
yes, it would, in my opinion.
Yeah,
But
we just add a retirement date. Yep.
okay. And but for you do want existing resources, so it's supposed to represent, everything.
Yep, everything for that year.
Everything. Okay, that's a helpful clarification. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary.
That's all I have for now. I know you probably saw that I sent around some other questions if we could get to some more of them later, but thanks for now.
Thank you. Mohan?
This is Mohan Nirolo with CWR. So I have a similar question on this slide. And I do see a difference between this slide with the actual posted template. The posted template does not have NQC, deliverability, location, area, etc. So I was curious to know why they are two different, being discussed here. So template has a little bit different state of data than this one.
Yeah, we should use the template, Mohan. This was, I wanted to highlight that this is not a survey discussion that just popped up. It has been discussed in the working group multiple times. So I just borrowed the slides from previous discussion presentations.
Okay, and for this existing resources, do we still need to write COD? For example, a resource that is online generating for 20 years. Do you need the COD 20 years back?
Yeah, once we add the retirement column and update how the summation will work, if it is needed, I will indicate that in the FAQ if that's okay.
Okay, because maybe, for the existing resources and the calculation formula uses COD. So I don't know if you go back before 2025, how that will work. Not sure. Yeah. Because we have a lot of resources there existing, and that's kind of confusing. And another piece is the total contracted capacity. And I think LSE may have owned resources. I mean, LSE does not contract for certain resources. So owned or contracted or something like that would be, that may clarify further. So,
yeah, that's a good point, Mohan. I think we will change that language to just say total capacity for peak month.
Yeah.
Remove the contract identifier there. Yeah,
okay.
Thank you so much for that feedback.
Thank you. Thanks.
Robert?
Robert Gomez, PG&E. On that line about where you're going to remove the contracted part and it'll say, I guess, total capacity. I might be missing something, but why wouldn't it be like what you have for the year ahead slide where it's the reserve requirement? Isn't that line supposed to be the reserve requirement, or am I missing something?
No, that is a better suggestion, Robert. Thanks. We'll just use a reserve requirement. That will make it simpler.
Okay. And then,
But the kicker was this. Now I remember. No, when we initially had reserve requirement, then there was a question that somebody asked, hey, we would not know what the NQC value will be for future, and then what do we assume for NQC? So that's why we changed that language to total contracted capacity and then asked contracted megawatts in the column to align with that. But yeah, the notes actually say, hey, calculate total resource obligation in this row. If you look at the spreadsheet that's posted on the website for row 4.
uh-huh. Okay. I mean, I'll just note that this this may assume that in any of these months, either the previous slide or in the midterm or long-term slide, that there are enough resources to meet the demand, and there may not be for various LSEs. So that's why reserve seems better to me than saying capacity, total capacity. Okay. The other question that I have is, what's the difference between location and area? Is
If you remove those columns.
Oh. And I mean, maybe this goes back to the question that was asked earlier, but it did seem to me that you were asking in the mid and long term that you just wanted the incremental information, because you're not asking for all. So the columns that are here in this particular example for the midterm, none of them are being asked in the previous, for year 2025. That's why it seems like these columns seem more important for, incremental resources. That's why I would have thought it was just the incremental that you're asking for here, but you're saying you want everything.
Yes, everything for that year. I think that's a good clarification to make. Yes. So we attempted to do that with the notes in the survey, in the what is posted, where we say, hey, put forecast here, put your PRM in next row, calculate the resource obligation, and then show all the resources that meet that requirement. Would be that check that's there. I'm realizing that I'm stealing Sam's thunder from his presentation slides, so I should just answer any high-level questions, and he will walk us through the survey, actually. So.
Okay, I'll hold my other questions for that then.
All right, thank you, Robert. Karen?
Hello, this is Karen Lee from Ava Community Energy. In the README overview, it says that LSEs should provide projected resource megawatts to meet the RA obligations for all months of 25 and peak months of 26 through 34. So should we include resources that we do not currently have contracted to build a portfolio that will meet the RA obligations forecasted out in 2034, for example?
Yeah, in principle, yes, Karen, I see that. That is another source of confusion here in the README, which will also elaborate and modify to indicate that it is asking for all resources in that time frame.
Okay, but we should include resources that are currently uncontracted to meet 100% of the RA obligation. Right. Okay, thank you.
Yes. Thanks, Karen. Robert, I see your hand up. Is that a old hand or is that a new one?
No, it's a new one. I know I promised to hold it, but since we just had this conversation, I should clarify because I'm not sure I got the clarification. So what I just heard you say, I think, is that if our current, like for instance, our current portfolio, in 2034, it doesn't meet the requirement, you're asking us to build out a plan of new resources, something that may not exist right now, and so basically to build out a whole long-term plan. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, sir. Some from your IRP could be another indicator of what resources you will be part of your portfolio, knowing fully that as time gets closer and closer, the actual resource additions may change, the resource types may change, but that's the idea. Yes, get all the resources, at least up to the reserve requirement.
Okay, thanks.
All right, now, if there are no other general questions on the intent of the survey, I will pass it to Sam to walk us through the survey in more detail.
All right, thanks, Aditya. So I'm going to just walk us through a little more clarification on the columns we're requesting and then some updates to the template. So in general, survey is requesting LSEs to provide projected RA eligible megawatts to cover 100% of what is required. So I know we just had discussion about that. So we are looking for all the resources, not just new incremental resources. And we're looking at monthly RA obligation for each month of 2025, and then obligation at the forecast annual peak month for 2026 to 2034. And that is the CAISO system peak is what we're looking at, not so it's the coincident CAISO peak. And LSE should use their LRA resource counting methodology and submit RA eligible contracted megawatts. I guess we did just get a clarification on if those are owned units, we would count those as well. So owned and contracted. Provide all information that's available. So if CAISO resource IDs or queue numbers are not available at that time, you can leave those blank. Planned resources can be given a generic placeholder name if they are not in development yet. Next slide, please. Installed capacity is the entire resource capability or capacity, and then contracted megawatts is the amount that will be used to serve that LSE's load. So a single resource may be split between LSEs, so you should just be showing your portion in that column. Paired generation and storage should not exceed the POI limit, so the point of interconnection limit, so indicate the amount by resource type in the notes. And yeah, please, use the notes column extensively. Anything you think we should know, go ahead and throw it in there. Fuel type categories should match those on the CAISO master control area generating capability list. Peak month should be consistent with the currently adopted CEC's 2023 IPER forecast. Please also include data for on-site generation that is used to charge grid-connected batteries. Again, you can use the notes column to further clarify anything. Next slide. As far as confidentiality, only aggregated results will be shared publicly. So LSEs, we won't be presenting anything that would be sensitive in that case. LSEs shouldn't submit any confidential or market sensitive information. This does not include information that's already protected under existing agreements. So resource IDs, load forecasts, queue numbers are things that we already have access to. So that's not really what we're discussing in that context. Okay, next slide. For periodicity, We are still working on determining the frequency of the survey. We're looking at further coordination with the CEC and CPUC as they are collecting similar information. So the goal for the future is to improve the process so that one entity can request all the information at one time, and we can kind of simplify this process versus having a bunch of independent surveys going on at the same time. Next. I guess I can pause for a second there.
Looks like we have 2 hands up, so let's go to Patrick Cunningham.
Patrick Cunningham at the Public Advocate's Office. You said that LSE should use the current RA counting rules for their LRA. For the CPUC LSEs, would that be like current RA rules we have now, or NQCs we use for slice of day, or for long-term resources, should we be using IRP counting rules for that?
That is a good question. Aditya, do you have any input on that?
For the year ahead, I think whatever will be applicable for the 2025 timeframe, but for long term, free to use the IRP counting rules.
Doesn't. Okay, that's all I have for now.
The reason I say that is this is right. We're trying to see what resources will be shown in that time frame. Right. And so when we overly prescribe it, then it gets like you are making a ton of assumptions in that time frame. Resource additions wise, you're making assumptions on your forecast. For example, the PRM percentage is an assumption. So yeah, if you have IRP counting rules, that's good. If you want to make the current NQC values for 25, that's fine. But as long as the resource mix is what is the most important outcome of this survey.
Right. I have to comment that there seems to be a whole lot of assumptions going into this data. I think Middle River Power was kind of getting at this, and Commission's RA requirements only go out to the next year. So we're asking LSEs to kind of assume and come up with what their contracts could be beyond that year that aren't actual contracts. There might be some LSEs that are 100% contracted for a couple of years, but I tell you, many of them are not. And if this is going to inform default PRM and default counting rules, I'm wondering, I'm not sure this data is going to be terribly useful because of the amount of assumptions and uncertainty that's going into it. Yeah, I just want to make that comment.
Thanks, Patrick. Noah?
Hey, Noah Tom from Middle River Power. Just following along what Patrick just said, it's if we go back to I'm kind of focused right now on the midterm tab of the template here. If it seems like the ISO is only looking at sort of peak month reliability and therefore sort of assuming that if a resource is contracted out for August or September, that in that time frame, then it's going to be there and contracted for the remainder of the year. Those are not quite the same relative to those assumptions are not the same as what we currently have on the monthly RA frameworks, right? Because we have load that's lower in the winter months, shoulder months relative, as compared to the summer months. So I'm trying to figure out, like, you ask for a PRM percentage, which if you PUCs make an assumption of 17% PRM, then and you have LSEs who are expected to make up a portfolio with uncontracted resources at this time, then you're going to get, if you make the assumption that portfolio is going to be the same as what you need for PRM, then what does the result tell you? If everybody's good, what, in this artificial portfolio, at the end of the day, when you aggregate them up, what does that tell you?
That's a loaded question, Noah. Let me try answering it from a couple of ways, right? So the reason we are only asking for September and assuming that portfolio will be available for 12 months in the assessments is to see if the fleet as a whole is sufficient, right? There are currently, the year ahead is different because there we are asking for 12 individual columns to see if there is enough resources in each of the months per the current RA program design, right? Which is going to be extremely cumbersome as we go out into the future. To have 12 times 10 is like 120 different columns of data, 120 different models. So the intent of longer term model is to be indicative. Like, is the system having the right kind of resources brought online in the right time frames? Will that make that system portfolio reliable? Those are all insights. For the longer term time frame, the nearer term is where accuracy can be achieved. There, I'm only looking for reasonableness. The value that it provides is we have assessments at different footprint levels, but looking at how the KISO BAA is from a reliability standpoint is what this exercise is trying to inform in the future, right? For us to be able to do it.
Right, but what you're asking is for LSEs to make up a fictitious portfolio, granted partially with existing contracts and contracts for new resources. I think you can do that. I think you can come up with whether or not the supply mix can meet reliability with a 1 in 10 LOE without even without asking that, for that information. And essentially, you've shifted the obligation of making various assumptions from sort of taking the ISO taking the lead to an LSE problem.
So maybe I should clarify one sentence there. It's not a ton of fictitious assumptions that are made because there are LSEs do long-term planning, right? They have their IRPs, they have their utility plans that they submit to the CEC. There's a ton of activity that happens in the longer term space also. So it is not wholly a fictitious portfolio. This is informed by a set of assumptions, by market prices, by costs of new resources, by what can be. So it is an actual assessment that the LSEs do. We are asking for views based on that knowledge.
I think we're going to have to agree to disagree. I think, as folks have said, certainly not everybody is 100% procured, and to the extent that they're not 100% procured for the midterm and the long term, then you are asking them to make up a portfolio, whether it be from something that they've provided to the PUC through IRP or something else. The issue is, goes back to how does this information get you to a default PRM value is quite different from a year ahead analysis versus a midterm and a long term analysis. I think these are completely two different things.
Yeah, the year ahead is the only assessment that will inform the default PRM and counting rules. The others are informative assessments in the future, longer term data points, right? So
that, yeah, maybe my sense is I think the ISO needs to look at more midterm in order to better signal what a default PRM ought to be to ensure reliability, because by the time you get to year ahead, it might be too late for that. We've seen that before. If you go back to the PUC and the ISO's, I think, Joint Reliability Plan, JRP, way back, something of this nature kind of also happened. It's again, these things are very loaded here. What you've asked for, if you look at column N and O for year ahead, the substitution for forced outages and forced outage substitute condition, it seems, I'm not sure anyone will know that for the time being, because it's a forced outage. It's not. So it's very odd to ask various, these particular questions for a year ahead type of showing.
Yeah, we will revisit those columns and see if we should include those or maybe remove those two things. Thanks. Noah. Robert?
Yeah, Robert Gomez, PG&E. I guess another question I have is maybe you may have answered this, but I just want clarity. So conversely to the conversation we're having about not having enough resources to meet our load. So what about in those situations where we have more resources, right? Than is the load, than the load and the requirement is. Are you asking us to chop it off at the requirement, or to show you, that extra amount too? Does that make sense?
Yeah, if it belongs to the LSE, please show, but we are asking at least show enough that meets the obligation.
I guess I just asked because it just sounds like the instructions were only show up to your requirement, and that I guess seemed a little odd to me, because I would assume that you'd want to know everything, right? So if our requirement is 10,000 megawatts, the instructions seem to me to indicate you only want us to show up to 10,000 megawatts, even though we may have 15. I'm making up numbers.
I think the README basically said should represent at least 100% of what is required to meet each month's need. Yeah, at least enough to meet the obligation, but if you have more, yeah, please include all those resources as well, because they are available to the BA.
Okay, and then this is more of I guess a CPUC requirement that you're asking for here. So nothing you don't need any information on planned outages, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And then on the slide where you talked about which month to use in the outer years, you said be consistent with the CEC IPER forecast. I have to admit, I'm not exactly sure what that means. There are many different IPER variations. So I'm not sure what you mean by be consistent with the CEC peak forecast.
Yeah, we will include the link to the latest CEC adopted 2023 IPER forecast.
Yeah, it just seems like if there is if we're talking about like the CAISO peak forecast, under their baseline assumptions, or it's coincident, or whichever one you're talking about, and if it's at the CAISO level, then it just seems like you can just tell us which month you want, because if you leave it up to 50 different organizations to calculate which is the peak month that they think that it is, you may get different you may get different interpretations of the CEC's forecasts because there are a lot of numbers in those forecasts.
Would September be a good month to assume? Because I think initially we started off saying September assume, and then somebody pushed back, and then we reverted back to this approach. But if September is a good month, I think I would like to stick with that.
I probably can't say on this forum what is a good month or not. It seems like it. I'm not sure how it works. What we would probably usually do is, pick our peak month.
Okay.
Yeah. The other
I will
question.
go back and look at the data and then add clarity on that as well.
Yeah. The other question I have is on the confidentiality slide. If you can go back to that one. Yeah, where you say, okay, so nothing should be confidential, except for information that's already protected under agreements. Do you have these agreements that you can, like, what are the agreements so that we know which ones you're referring to there?
I want to see if one of the lawyers is on the call, but I think what I was told is the current NDAs, and then you have the TO agreement, all of them protect confidentiality already. So there is no need to have an LSE by LSE confidentiality agreement.
I guess I only mentioned that because usually when we submit confidential information, even though you're asking for non-confidential, to us, much of this stuff is confidential in general. We'd have to cite the appropriate confidentiality NDAs or, agreements and such.
Yeah, I can check on that, what confidentiality agreement, but what I was told is it's already protected, so there is no need for an additional one as we receive that. But I can add clarity on that. That's a good question. Thanks.
Yep, thank you.
I see a comment from Mary Neal that the IPER has a July peak, and that was another reason why we left it to folks to go see the IPER and use that as it changes from July to September in the future years. But yeah, we will probably indicate what month in the revised template. Mary?
Hi, Mary Neal again with ARM. I just wanted to follow up on an earlier conversation you were having with Cal Advocates about what resource counting rules to use, and I thought I heard someone say it was okay to use CPUC IRP counting rule assumptions, which I didn't think would be appropriate because I thought this was really supposed to be RA, and the IRP counting and load forecasts is like completely different from RA rules. So did I just mishear that? Could you clarify that again?
So what I mentioned earlier is we could use, if we have a counting rule framework defined for a future term, we could use that, was the assumption, because that is what your IRP would be planning for from a fleet perspective for that particular year, right? But then, yeah, let me take it back and clarify what exactly we mean by that counting rule for the future time frame, just so that it is clear.
Yeah, because that's obviously really important.
Yes.
All the LSEs use different methods. You're just gonna get gobbledygook. Okay. And we already talked about the peak month, so that was helpful clarification. I did have another. I wanted to clarify something about batteries for counting rules for batteries are obviously a hot topic. But if when I was interpreting your current instructions, I was interpreting reporting the contracted megawatts for a 4-hour duration, but that wouldn't give you any information if it were like a long duration battery that really had an 8-hour capability. So I assume you do want that reported somewhere to be able to to properly count the duration in a study, like an LOLE study.
Yep, that will for sure be useful. Yeah, we'll probably add a comment that says include that in the notes for long duration storage because I don't believe we have a lot of them quite yet.
Right, but they're in the queue from the
Yep.
CPUC. Okay. And then on fuel type, I know that there's a lot of different ways entities classify fuel type. Like you could use hydro or you could say water. Is there one in particular you wanted to follow, like a CAISO standard?
This is actually a good idea. Probably show a bucket of a list of fuel types.
Right, because if you also go out far enough in the future, you may have some like new technologies show up, like carbon capture and storage, and so it'd be harder for LSEs to know what to report there. So it would be helpful if you could provide some additional instructions on that.
Thank you. We'll add that, and then we'll probably include something called as other, for example, for that is not part of the shown 10 or 11 categories.
Right. And then also to follow up on the discussion we've had about what's really being reported here. You're talking about with NOAA. Is this really supposed to be like an LSE goes to its latest IRP and then reports what's in there? Because, for instance, if that comes up short to the requirement for the CAISO RA, I guess that wouldn't make as much sense. And then it just also makes it, or is it even, or if I misinterpreted, could it just be, any up-to-date portfolio assumption because the IRPs, for instance, from the CPUC were filed 2 years ago now and are out of date. For instance, they may have contracts that have been canceled. So, but if you deviate from that IRP, then you sort of end up putting LLCs in a position of doing an IRP in a month, which they may not be able to do. So I'm a little conflicted there as to, how to instruct an LLC to provide you something meaningful. So do you have a better sense of like, is this really supposed to be something that's already been reported to an LRA, or can this sort of be anything goes, any latest view from an LLC?
Yeah, I'd say a latest view from an LSE standpoint would be useful.
So it's not really restricted in that sense. Like it's not restricted to what's been reported in an IRP.
Yeah, in this round, we all can be a little more creative, but next time or next year, when we do this collectively by coordinating with the PUC and CUC, we may have more direct instructions on exactly how it needs to be filled. But for this time round, creativity is okay.
Okay. Okay. I think that's all I have for the moment. I'll raise my hand again if I need to. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Rainey. Steve Keen.
Southern California Edison. I have a couple different things, and some of them have already been talked about. The one is just with confidentiality. Anything you could do to clear up some of that? Like what if we submit information that we already have an NDA? Will this information be considered to be under that NDA? So if you can clear up how that would work, and then just when you say only aggregated results will be shared publicly, I assume that they'll be aggregated in such a way that it won't be possible to identify who's provided what, and that you won't publish it if you can figure out who's providing it. Okay, thank you for those clarifications. The other couple questions, I'm looking at the form you have on the website, and you're asking in the midterm and the long term for the contracted megawatts. I'm assuming you're asking for that rather than NQCs because you're going to put in an NQC. And I'm just trying to figure out, because if that's supposed to be the NQCs, then in different years those could change. And what I'm thinking with that is in the CPUCs, like in their midterm procurement, there were different ELCCs that would be used in different years.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on when the resource was. It's not even so much when it's coming online, it's when you were reporting it as coming, as fitting into the requirements and stuff. I guess this is one thing that it's related to my next question, which is when you get this information in, since it's a voluntary survey, if there are some LSEs that don't choose to participate and don't give you any information, how are you going to deal with that? And that gets to the same one, that if you're asking for the contracted megawatts, how are you going to essentially figure out what the NQCs will be in those future years for the various LSEs and the LRAs?
So it's like a chicken and egg situation, right? You need NQC to count towards the obligation, and then that's how you check if you have enough obligations met for that particular year. But in the model, that NQC doesn't play a big role, right? It basically looks at the whole resource and its ability to produce electricity for the 8760 timeline, that when it produces the entire portfolio, and then it comes up with the loss of load expectation. So for that, I need the full resource or partial resource, however it is identified appropriately, and then its energy generating capability. So yeah, let me take that question back and probably add some more information on what we exactly mean. So there are two paths. I don't want to brainstorm in real time, but I'll probably add more clarity on what we mean by that.
Yeah, and let me just, there's one other question, that since we're dealing with stuff out in the future, and with some of these resources, it may not be clear at this point whether they're going to get full deliverability status or partial deliverability status. So I don't, I'm not sure whether you need to take that into account or whether that needs to factor in.
Yeah, we thought that it will be useful at least in the midterm in the previous slides which you saw, but then we took it off because then resource and transmission are also connected, right? You have transmission, you get deliverability, you have a resource, then transmission will be built, and all of these things are aligned with the long-term TPP, and then hopefully all of them will come together through time. So yeah, for this high-level broad brush assessment, I don't think we want to get into that level of specificity with regards to deliverability, but yeah, we did think about that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Tony Zimmer.
A process question, I think, speaking to the last caller. In the ISO's reporting of the aggregate data, if one or more LSEs elect not to respond, will that be just noted, or will the ISO identify, what a portion of the load was not reported on? Or I was just trying to get a sense of if, say, not all LSEs responded, would that naturally reflect an artificial deficiency per se, or would you be reporting an aggregate based on the LSEs that did report relative to their sub, I guess, aggregated requirement? I just want to make sure if 9 of 10 reported that it didn't show an artificial deficiency per se because one didn't report. I was just curious how you're going to handle that.
So when the surveys will be, obviously all the LSEs have received a note on the survey. We will reach out to LSEs that have not responded, or LSEs that have only provided partial information, for example, asking them to consider providing full information where available, and try and get as much information as we can for this assessment. But when it comes to reporting, I have, meaning we haven't thought through how we plan to report. If it's, meaning every LSE has to be represented in the model, the analysis. It's not an LSE by LSE model, but the LSE resources have to be represented in the model. Depending on the number and megawatts of the LSEs that have not responded, we will have to come up with a plan to incorporate their reviews into the system. So yeah, I think that method of filling the gap or will be determined based on what LSEs that chose not to respond to this survey. So
okay, no, I appreciate that. And yeah, so I think, as an LSE speaking, the one thing that we'll probably want to, maybe we'll submit questions or comments, just get a little bit more clarity of ultimately how's the data going to be used. Because once we provide information and may not have an absolute clear understanding where it's going, there's always some concern as to how it could be used or interpreted without context. But in any case, we're happy to discuss with you further, but appreciate that feedback.
thank you, Tony. And this is a request. If anybody has specific questions that they would like to chat offline, please feel free to reach out to Sam or myself, and we'll be happy to set up that touch point. Maylene?
Unmute Mary.
Hi, yeah, Mary from ARM. Again, I just went back through my notes and I had a couple more clarifying questions to ask. So, I know in reporting for CPUC purposes, there was a lot of confusion about LSE sales data. So if an LSE, contracts for a resource and then sells part of the capacity to another LSE, do you want that sale to be reported in this template, like as a negative value, or do you just want to report a net value? Do you care? I guess, I don't know.
This is my thinking silence. Maybe I don't know per se, but let's say if that other LSE is also part of the ISO, then it will probably be shown on their plan. Then maybe it needs to be reduced. But if it is not part, or if it's part of another aggregation, right? I think it is very dependent on a case by case basis. I don't know how to answer that question.
Okay, so it sounds like it's not something that, like if the LLC did report some negative value and noted it was a sale, you wouldn't reject the template or something like that. I don't know. That was always
No,
a
we'll
concern.
probably ask for a clarification of, no, we'll
Okay.
probably ask for a clarification of what that means, but no.
Okay, and then was the installed capacity field, was that supposed to be reported on a nameplate basis for capacity, or is that it's still like a QC megawatt basis?
Last Sam for confirmation, but we were thinking installed capacity was nameplate.
Nameplate, okay.
Yeah.
And then it would just be the contracted megawatts that would be a QC that would be compared to the obligation. Is that right? Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, thanks. That was I think we got through all the questions I had going in, though it sounds like we're still be looking for some further clarifications from you all. So look forward to that. Thanks.
Yeah, and clarifications will only be based on what questions were asked today. So if there is anything new that was not discussed, please reach out and let us know. We'll add it to that document, and we'll also revise and post a new survey to the website soon.
Okay, so looks like that's all the questions for now. So back to the timeline, we're looking at May 16 to have the survey due. Submit responses through the city. And I believe these slides are posted, and there's a link to instructions on setting up a city account if you don't have one. And direct questions to me or Aditya. And then just a reminder, next working group is the 29th and 30th, and that'll be hybrid. So there's an in-person option as well if you want to register for that. I think that's the last slide.
Thanks, Sam and Aditya. Before we wrap up, I just have a few reminders to share with the group. So we do publish blogs to our Energy Matters blog, and I wanted to highlight the most recent one that we published last week on working groups. So I encourage you to check out the blog if you haven't already. And then a couple save the dates. So the ISO is hosting an NRI meeting, a new resource implementation meeting on May 1st. And if you plan to attend in person, just a reminder to please register by end of day, April 26th. And then the final agenda and presentation will be available prior to the meeting out on the public forums webpage. And then also the ISO is hosting its stakeholder symposium this year at the Safe Credit Union Convention Center on October 30th. We're also going to be hosting a welcome reception for all attendees the evening of October 29th. And we'll be sharing additional information, including details on registration and sponsorship opportunities in the coming weeks through a future notice and on the ISO's website. But if you have any questions, you can contact the symposium team at symposiumreg@kaiso.com with any questions. And then lastly, I just wanted to make you all aware that the ISO will be launching its new website in late May, and it will be hosting some training sessions towards the end of May, May 23rd and May 29th. The times here are listed here. And we'll be issuing more information on the launch of the new website through notices in the daily briefing and also on our social media accounts. So with that, I will pause and see if there are any last questions before we conclude today.
Yeah, one question I wanted to ask the group is May 16th sufficient time for all the LSEs to get this information, or would you rather prefer a week more? Robert?
All right, I'll chime in. I think more would be helpful, especially since if things are going to be changing, like it seems like there may be, you know, I don't think folks want to head down a path and then realize, oh, you know, there's one other thing that we have to get for our 400 resources. At least for PG&E, we have a lot of resources. So I think it would be helpful, given the discussion we just had today, and that there's more clarifications that are still being needed, to extend the time.
Okay, thanks. Is a week extension enough, or do you guys want 2 weeks through the end of May? Because I want this to be used and useful by all of us. So
I think the end of May sounds more appropriate, but others can chime in.
okay. Thank you, Robert. I see a message from Lauren Carr saying more time would be good. Regarding when will the revision be posted, I think we plan to post it by the end of this week. So we should have 3-4 weeks beyond that. So I think we'll start moving the date to May 31st as the due date. If that's okay, and thank you so much. And I really want to appreciate each one of you for helping us with your points of view, the questions and thoughts on the survey and how to improve it, and all the clarifying questions that will be needed for you all to provide useful information back to us. So the different time horizon assessments will be useful, and then as you repeat this over time, I think it will be more and more informative and more useful as it relates to resources, resource efficiency, resource capabilities, and facilitate the fleet transition from an ISO standpoint to have enough resources across all time horizons to meet the resource adequacy of the system. So this is the first step in that journey, and I really, truly appreciate all your engagement and input and feedback today. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for your time this afternoon. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you to all of our speakers. Thanks to all of our speakers, and thanks to all of the audience for joining us today. With that, the call has concluded and you may disconnect.